Hey everybody, how you doing tonight? Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to have you all here with us. Be sure to hit the like button, be sure to hit the subscribe button, be sure to hit the notifications bell. We are going to have a great program tonight. I'm going to engage with you, answer all your questions, do all the fun stuff we normally do here. It's going to be awesome. So welcome everybody. So glad that you're here. Yeah, all right. Let's get rolling.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be with you here tonight. Great stuff happening. Yeah, it's going to be fun. So be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Always good to hit the notifications bell. Oh, we'll turn the light on. There we go. Now you can see my face much more clearly. It's going to be fun. Make sure you're subscribed. YouTube sometimes has this weird algorithmic thing where people get unsubscribed. So make sure that you're subscribed. Make sure that you're subscribed. And on top of that, make sure that you hit the notifications bell so you get notified. If you want to tweet this out, post this different places, that would be awesome. And yeah, the way this works, for those of you who may be new, is I do my opening remarks. Which are then followed at that point by a roll call where I call you all out as I see you, your names and locations. I call you out as I see you. And then after that, after I call you out as I see you, names and locations, then I answer your super chat questions for the rest of the night. That second half of the show is all you guys. It's you guys asking me super chat questions and I answer them. That's how we do it. So if you have something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, now is the time. Now is the time to shoot me a super chat question. I will type it down. Oh boy, got to button my button on my shirt here. Wild times. I will type it and I will answer it in the second half of the show. Thinking about interviewing anyone from the Amazon Union or the Starbucks Union. I will write that down. The answer, Chaya, is yes, but I will give a more thorough answer during the Q&A. Interviewing anyone from Starbucks or Amazon Union. Very, very good. And keep the super chats rolling in. That's how we make sure the second half of the show is awesome. That's how we do it. So yeah. All right. So tonight we are going to talk about a lovely topic. We are going to talk about Satanism. Yes, you heard that right. We are going to talk about Satanism. But we are going to talk about Satanism with 4 different definitions of Satanism. 4 different definitions of Satanism and what they mean. The first definition of Satanism is what we can call constructive Satanism. Now, let me back up before we get into that. When we talk about Satanism, right? Every culture, every religion, every belief system has some kind of concept of good and bad, good and evil, etc. But what do these things mean? What do they mean in politics? What do they mean in life? It's an interesting topic. So I want to delve into it a little bit because I have 4 different definitions of Satanism, which I think we can all kind of more or less relate to. So the first definition of Satanism that I will go with is what I would call constructive Satanism. which I think is an interesting one, because you generally think of Satanism as being bad. You generally think of Satanism as just being purely bad. But, interestingly, if you read the book of Job in the Christian Bible, Satan is very different in the book of Job than he is presented throughout a lot of Christian theology. And this is reflective of the Hebrew tradition, that Satan is one of God's angels who tests your faith, who tests your loyalty. You can see that in different traditions. The idea is that God, the force of good, has a special angel whose job isn't to help you. His job is to bring hardship into your life, whose job is to present you with tests, to ask you tough questions, to point out your flaws, and in doing so, reveal who you truly are, reveal your strengths, test your loyalty, test your resilience, etc. And that's the idea. And constructive Satanism is an important part of any organization. You always want to have somebody there asking the tough questions. You always want to have somebody there troubleshooting the worst case scenarios. You always want to have somebody there who cares about you enough to point out your real flaws. And this is something that, individuals recognize, right? Those who love you the most will criticize you, right? This is something that organizations will realize, right? If you ever develop a culture in the organization where people can't get up and point out flaws, the organization is going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. Why? Because the flaws and problems will never be addressed. This is true of countries. This is true of religions, etc. You want to have somebody whose job it is, who plays the role of nitpicking, revealing flaws. And that kind of person is very, very important. And a healthy organization, a healthy person, a healthy community, a healthy country, a healthy company, corporation will recognize that having somebody who gets up and says, whoa, 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 the way we're doing things now might be okay, but if this problem arises, this could go wrong. That's helpful. Someone who gets up and says, now I agree with what you're saying for the most part, but there's a flaw in what you're saying. That's helpful. People will often talk about the story of the emperor who has no clothes. You ever hear of this? The emperor who has no clothes, right? It's a story, Aesop's fable. It's one of these old stories, right? That the emperor hires a tailor, and the tailor is a con man. And the tailor says to the emperor, I'm giving you these magical clothes that only good people can see. And the emperor assumes that other people can see it. So he wears these magical clothes. But they're not actually clothes. The tailor is a con man. And so the emperor walks out completely naked. And no one is brave enough to tell the emperor that he has no clothes on, because he's the emperor. And no one wants to point out the flaws. No one wants to say that he's wrong. Right? And that is a situation you never want to develop in any organization. BFF in South Africa, socialism in Angola. You never want that to develop in any organization. If there's a problem, you want people to get up and be able to address it. If there is a way that things are developing that is not helpful, you want to be able to get up and say that they're wrong. Abraham Lincoln, interesting fact. Many people don't know this, but Abraham Lincoln was basically an agnostic, right? He used religious language because that was the style of the time, but he was basically an agnostic, and he had a very well-known reputation when he was living in Illinois. He would go to churches and debate the pastors. Did you know this? Abraham Lincoln, he was a lawyer, a well-educated man, but he was from unsettled territory in Illinois. Illinois was a new state in the United States. It just entered the United States, entered the Union. And Abraham Lincoln was notorious for going to churches and debating the pastors. He would get up and he would ask the standard questions about the Bible. It says the snake went on its tail after it got Eve to eat the apple. What did the snake do before that? What about these others that Adam and Eve meet up with in the next county? What about contradictory things in the Bible? Abraham Lincoln would go to churches and debate the pastors. Nowadays, people would consider that to be a really rude, disrespectful thing to do. If someone showed up at your church and was saying, I think you're wrong, and would debate the pastor, you'd say, that guy is a disrespectful jerk. He needs to go to his own church. He needs to get the hell out of here. Who does he think he is? But apparently, back in Abraham Lincoln's time, many pastors were happy that Abraham Lincoln did that, because that gave them an opportunity to test their ideas and to practice engaging and debating, and that it made the church services much more lively. And so when Abraham Lincoln, the lawyer who eventually became a U.S. senator and eventually became president of the United States, when Abraham Lincoln showed up at their church and debated them and said, how do you know this is true? How do you know that these miracles happen? Would debate these pastors as an agnostic. It was seen as a good thing. It was constructive Satanism. It was holding you accountable, telling you things you don't want to hear. When people argue with you and they say they're playing the devil's advocate, this is what they're getting at. They are criticizing you. They are challenging you. They are troubleshooting you for your ultimate benefit. And that you need someone to play that role in any healthy organization. If at any point you have an organization where people are not able to get up and say, I think this is a problem, where people are not able to point out flaws, where problems just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and anyone who gets up and says that there's a problem, gets attacked for it, gets punished for it, you are not in a healthy organization. The Soviet Union, one of the big problems that the Soviet Union had, and I've said this many times, is that the Soviet Union fell to the sound of applause. The Soviet party congresses, Khrushchev would come out, started with Stalin. Stalin came out, and everyone would applaud for Stalin. Well, the guy did defeat the Nazis. He did raise the country up from poverty. I think Stalin, in many ways, people would consider him to be worthy of applause. But after Stalin died, Khrushchev came into power. Khrushchev took a dump all over Stalin. Said that Stalin was evil, Stalin was a mass murderer, and what did all the same people that had just applauded for Stalin, they applauded for Khrushchev. Then in 1964, Kosygin and Brezhnev arrested Khrushchev and threw out Khrushchev. And Brezhnev and Kosygin took power, and they said Khrushchev was no good, he was a traitor to socialism. All the same people applauded for Kosygin and Brezhnev for toppling Khrushchev. And then Brezhnev died, and then you had Andropov, and eventually you got Gorbachev. And Gorbachev came into power. Gorbachev said, instead of class struggle, we need universal human values. And Gorbachev said, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are good people. And the same people who'd applauded for Brezhnev, applauded for Khrushchev, applauded for Gorbachev. And eventually the Soviet Union fell. And part of the reason that the Soviet Union fell, many people will admit, is because of this problem, that there was no constructive Satanism. No one could get up and say, there's a problem. An atmosphere was created where the only acceptable thing on the part of the membership was applause. And there were real problems in the Soviet Union. And those problems intensified in the 60s, and they intensified in the 70s, and they intensified in the 80s. But by the time they'd intensified in the 80s, Gorbachev came in, and the way he tried to fix them was so confused and messy that it led to the fall of the Soviet Union. And it would have been much more healthy if there had been debate among the Soviet Communist Party leadership. It would have been much more healthy if dissident elements weren't simply being dragged away and arrested in the middle of the night. It would have been healthier if those who disagreed with the Soviet system could get up and publicly say it. And the problems that they were pointing to that made them disagree with the Soviet system could be addressed by the Soviet leaders. But because of the fact that they'd been surrounded and invaded, 15 different countries invaded the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. World War II, 27 million people died. The Soviet Union developed this very, very authoritarian and rigid system that did not allow for any constructive Satanism. And no one was able to get up and say, these are our problems. They just applauded. And the problems got worse and worse and worse. And by the time they had to address them, they addressed it in such a messy way that the Soviet Union fell. And this is a problem, right? When you don't have constructive Satanism. That's one form of Satanism. And I will say it's actually a good form of Satanism, right? You'd say a good form of Satanism is kind of an oxymoron. But if one looks at some of the Hebrew tradition where Satan is an angel who works for God, who tests your faith, this kind of Satanism is actually quite constructive. You need it in any healthy organization, any healthy family, any healthy relationship, any healthy individual should be open to criticism, any healthy group, corporation. It's important. So that's the first type of Satanism. The second type of Satanism I will call teenage Satanism or contrarianism. And this is a type of behavior. It's a type of behavior where people simply want to break social norms. They simply want to go against authority. And they simply want to assert their individualism. And it's very adolescent. It's very teenage. But some people never grow out of it. And it's a big problem in communist circles. Why? Why is it a big problem in communist circles? Because we live in a society where communism is Satan, right? Stalin, they tell us over and over again, Stalin was worse than Hitler. Stalin was worse than Hitler. Communism never worked. It failed everywhere it's ever been tried. The United States is great because it saved the world from communism. So in the United States, to start becoming interested in communism and socialism and Marxism is to indulge the forbidden. It is to break the rules. It leads you to admiring figures like Fidel Castro or Kim Il-sung, who we've been told are nothing but evil dictators. And it leads you to engaging and advocating the opposite of what we've all been taught. And it's different in other countries. You live in Latin America, right? If you live in, you live in Bolivia, you live in Venezuela, even if you live in a moderate country in Latin America, they might not view Fidel Castro as Satan. Now, they may view Fidel Castro in a negative light, and some people may view him in a more positive light, but it's not the same thing. Maybe in Pinochet's Chile, he was viewed as Satan, but if you're living in different parts of the world, people have different attitudes about these things. But the United States is the capital of capitalism. It's the world center of anti-communism. So being a communist in the United States means that you're embracing the exact opposite of what you're being told. And that's fine. However, it leads to a certain mindset. It leads to a certain mindset that means you're going against the status quo, which is fine. But it can take on a kind of childish adolescent character. And the reason I call it Satanism, because it's actually very, very similar to the teenager who, starts wearing a pentagram necklace, starts listening to Ozzy Osbourne. They're literally a Satanist. Why? Because they're living in a Christian society. And Satan is the enemy or the opponent in Christianity. And because of that, they are embracing Satan. Are these people actually following the teachings of Anton LaVey? Are they actually worshiping a deity called Satan? Are they actually believing in an ideology that is contrary to Christian teaching? No. They are sticking it to their parents. They are sticking it to authority. They are giving the middle finger to their mom and dad. They are giving the middle finger to their teachers. They are saying, I am a devil worshiper. And it's a certain psychology that many people grow out of. but it's an adolescent phase. It's an adolescent phase. And it's fine. I mean, it's fine to have a phase like that where you're asserting your independence, right? You'll have teenagers who will, convert to Buddhism. You'll have teenagers who will become vegetarian in order to reject their parents' dietary habits. This is a normal phase of development. Right, writing it down. Normal phase of development. But it's not politics. This is emotion. And it's a big problem in Marxist and leftist circles, because there are many people who get interested in our kind of politics simply because it is the opponent, simply because it is the enemy. And at that point, it becomes not serious politics. This was very clearly manifested in the 1960s left. There was somebody I knew years ago, a boomer leftist, a communist. And the more I got to know this person, a woman, the more I realized that this is what her politics were about. I asked her life story, how she got involved with Marxist politics. She was a college student in New York City in the late 60s when protesting the war was a thing that went on. And she liked how the protesters would go out and break windows, and how the protesters would punch people and scuffle with the police. And she thought that was badass and it was exciting. She told me how at these protests in the 1960s, a lot of these people were not really political at all. One of the chants they would do at their demonstrations was smoke dope, get high, all the cops are gonna die. Smoke dope, get high, all the cops are gonna die. Now, that is one of the stupidest chants I've ever heard in my life, right? We're advocating murder of police officers. We're advocating drug use. Yeah, that's really great. Two really awesome messages there. It's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. But that was a big part of the 1960s hippie counterculture protest movement. Smoke dope, get high, all the cops are going to die. All right, they would chant that. And they would break windows. There was actually an organization in New York City at one point. I kid you not. There was a left-wing activist group called the Motherfuckers. That's actually what they were called. The Motherfuckers. And why would they call themselves the Motherfuckers? They would call themselves the Motherfuckers because that's a bad word. And in fact, at the time in New York City, one could be jailed for saying it. Lenny Bruce, the comedian, went to jail for saying motherfuckers on stage. And the group, actually, their chant, their salute was what Lenny Bruce had said. Lenny Bruce, the comedian, he was speaking at a comedy club in the early 60s, and he told a joke, and the punchline of the joke was, "This is a stick up against the wall, motherfuckers." And he said that. The NYPD were in the audience. They handcuffed him and arrested him for obscenity. You can't say that word in public. So this group, the leader of the group would hold his fist up in the air and shout, "Up against the wall." And the whole group would shout, "Motherfuckers!" This is Satanism. This is childishness, right? This is childishness. This isn't real politics. But she was an activist, and she liked how the communists were out, not even the communists, but these hippies were out in the street doing that. And then she got involved with a group in New York City called the New York City Committee to Support the Vietnamese. Now, why did she join this group? Did she join it because she really, in her heart, felt that the Vietnamese people were right and U.S. imperialism was wrong? There were many people during this time period who did feel that way. There were many people that supported the Vietnamese people in their struggle against U.S. imperialism. That wasn't her. She joined the New York City Committee to Support the Vietnamese. She joined them because they walked through the streets of New York City waving the flag of the enemy. That's true. They did. They waved the flag of the Vietnamese, and they chanted, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. The NLF is going to win. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh." A great chant. And I know many people who chanted that because they meant it, because they understood what it meant. But for her, it was very much just, I'm being bad. I'm breaking the rules. I'm going against what I'm being told. And I knew this person years later because they got involved in activism. And they were involved in helping someone else I know apply for something. I can't even get into specifics of it. But she was basically helping them be deceptive in the way that they applied for this thing. And it was one of the weirdest things I'd ever seen. This was not a young person. This was somebody well over 60 years old. Might have even been 70 at the time. I think at least well over 60. Let me just put it that way, mid 60s. And she's sitting there helping someone fill out an application, and they're putting false information on this application. And she gets this grin on her face. Yes, we're going to lie. We're going to lie. I love it. I love it. And she's thrilled by breaking the rules. This is stupid. This is childishness. This is what I would call teenage Satanism, adolescent Satanism. This is what you might call contrarianism. Right. This is not real politics. It's not real politics. It's a form of arrested development. It's the person who's stuck in their teen years. They're aroused, they're thrilled by breaking the rules. And their politics, for whatever reason, is rooted in that. It's rooted in saying bad words. It's rooted in breaking the rules. It's rooted in sticking it to authority. It's rooted in childishness. And this form of Satanism is not helpful. It's not constructive. And I would argue that it's something that we really ought to find out how we can get beyond. Now, it's one thing to recognize that whoever the U.S. imperialists are going after, we stand in solidarity with them against U.S. imperialism. Right on, brother. I'm with you. It's one thing to recognize that we would never support the capitalist government in going after anybody in the working class movement. And we would always stand with the oppressed against the oppressor. I'm with you. But when it becomes a fetish, when it becomes, we're going to break the rules, I like the enemy, I'm badass, when it becomes that, it's silly. It's completely silly. And that for a lot of internet communists, this is what their politics is rooted in. They are telling their mom and dad that, they're wrong. They're telling their mom and dad that they're wrong. They're asserting their independence as a person. They're defying authority. They're disrespecting sacred institutions. They're violating social norms. It's childish. It's not real politics. But this is a kind of very prevalent, a very, very prevalent form of politics. And we need to get beyond that, right? I mean, it's a phase we all go through. You're not a bad person for feeling this way. I certainly felt this way a lot when I was a teenager. But it's not serious politics. So that's would be the second form of Satanism. We've gone over constructive Satanism. Now we just went over teenage Satanism, contrarian Satanism, adolescent Satanism. The next type of Satanism that I would go over is probably the most literal form of Satanism. I mean, the Church of Satan, this is what they actually believe. All right. Does psychoanalysis have any value? And I mean, I will actually pull up John Galt's speech. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, one of his most favorite writers who he recommends is Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, the anti-communist philosopher, the author of Atlas Shrugged, the author of The Fountainhead. This is the climax of the Atlas Shrugged book by Ayn Rand. Your acceptance of the code of selflessness has made you fear the man who has a dollar less than you because it makes you feel that your dollar is rightfully his. You hate the man with a dollar more than you because the dollar he's keeping is rightfully yours. Your code has made it impossible to know when to give and when to grab. You know that we can't give away everything and starve yourself. You're forced yourselves to live with undeserved irrational guilt. Is it ever proper to help another man? No. If he demands it as his right or as his duty, then that you owe him. Yes, it's your own free choice based on judgment of the person and his struggle. This country wasn't built by men who sought handouts. In its brilliant youth, this country showed the rest of the world what greatness was to the man and what happiness is possible on earth. But then it began apologizing for its greatness and giving away its wealth and feeling guilty for having produced more than its neighbors. Right? I swear by my life and my love that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for the sake of mine. Selfishness as a virtue. Your world is only the product of sacrifices. While you were dragging the men who made your happiness possible to your sacrificial altars, I beat you to it. I reached them first and told them about the game you were playing. You read the John Galt speech from Atlas Shrugged. This is a rejection of morality. It's saying don't love your neighbor. It's saying don't be kind to others. It's saying don't be selfless. Don't help other people. Now, this is evil. It's very, very evil. It's very, very evil. You listen to Ayn Rand, you read The Fountainhead, you read Atlas Shrugged. This is evil stuff. It's saying that one should not have empathy. One should be purely self-interested. One should not help their fellow man. And that shit is dangerous. I don't know how else to put it. And it's the ideology of capitalism. Ayn Rand called capitalism the unknown ideal. The unknown ideal. The idea was capitalism had never been enacted because we have a post office, because we have government subsidized railroads, we have a military. But capitalism is a society where no one helps anyone else. Capitalism is a society where the government completely keeps its hands off. Capitalism is a society where greed is unrestrained. Ayn Rand wrote about the virtue of selfishness, the idea that people should never have empathy for other people, that the problems of the world are rooted in altruism, that man's empathy for other men, men's sympathy for other people, men's desire to do unto others as they would have them do unto them is the problem. Kindness, compassion are weaknesses. Greed, self-indulgence, cruelty, indifference to others is morality. This kind of anti-moral teaching that says your attitude should be screw everybody else, I'm in it only for myself. That stuff is Satanism. I don't know what you want to call it. You want to call it political Satanism. You want to call it, it's pure doctrinaire Satanism. It's what Anton LaVey actually believed. It's capitalism. It's ideological capitalism. It is anti-moralism, straight up anti-moralism. And it's dangerous and it's problematic. And it's what most of the elite in the United States believe. Now, Ayn Rand, she wrote those novels. Ayn Rand is for the masses. Ayn Rand is for business school majors. Ayn Rand is for edgy teenagers. Ayn Rand is for, for right guys who listen to right-wing radio. But they have a more sophisticated version of Ayn Rand for the educated classes. For the educated classes, they've got Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche, his view, is a little bit more sophisticated. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his book Beyond Good and Evil, argues that the Christian teaching, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is the slave morality. It's the slave morality. It's the ideology of weak people invented to give them consolation. But the master morality is one that worships strength. And he talks about the Roman Empire, and he talks about ancient Greeks, and he talks about a society where people are purely living for pleasure and, and not empathetic to others, and, fulfilling their great strength by beating down others. And he argues that Christianity is just something invented by the oppressed, invented by the weak to give themselves consolation. But really, we need to go back to might makes right. We need to go back to hedonism. We need to go back to greed is good. We need to go back to this kind of thinking. Now, this is a more sophisticated version of the Ayn Rand way of thinking. And both of these philosophies, the Nietzsche philosophy as well as the Ayn Rand philosophy, view the people as the enemy. Right? John Galt's speech is all about how the great men are persecuted. The reason that the rich are rich is they're just so much better than everybody else. They're so much better than everybody else, and the other people are just trying to bring down the superior ones. And Friedrich Nietzsche has a similar mindset. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche hated the Paris Commune of 1871. A lot of his writing in his final years was dedicated to tearing down the Paris Commune, accusing the Paris Commune of 1871 of being an evil thing because it was the rabble rising up. And on top of Ayn Rand, Friedrich Nietzsche, you have Leo Strauss, the ideological father of neoconservatism. Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor. He wrote Persecution and the Art of Writing. And Leo Strauss, he had lived in Germany, and he fled Germany, moved to the United States. He taught at the New School University, eventually moving to the University of Chicago. And Leo Strauss, he argued that all of the great philosophers throughout history, Plato, Socrates, Kant, Descartes, they all wrote in code. And the reason they wrote in code was because they were persecuted. Because if they said what they really believed, the rabble would punish them. The average people who weren't as smart as they were, who couldn't understand the world with their superior rational mind, would punish them. So they had to write in code. And that if you read Plato, if you read Kant, if you read Descartes, there's two ways of reading it. There's the way the masses would read it, and then there's the coded way that the educated elite could read it. And of course, Leo Strauss, he knows the sophisticated way. If you listen to him, he'll tell you what the texts really mean. Many critics of Leo Strauss have looked at Leo Strauss's writing and said, how do you know? How do you know that that's what Socrates and Plato really meant? How do you know that? How do you know what Descartes really meant? How do you know that? Who told you? Who gave you the decoding machine with which to read philosophy? It's kind of one of those things you just kind of have to believe him. But underlying Leo Strauss's strange interpretation of philosophers throughout history, there is the belief that the intellectuals, the great ones, have always lived in fear of the rabble. Just like Ayn Rand talks about the mob and coming after John Galt. Just like Nietzsche is talking about how much he hates the Paris Commune. Central in the worldview of doctrinaire, moral, philosophical Satanism is this belief that there are the chosen ones, there are the great ones who sit at the center, the elite, and the elite must be protected at all costs from the rabble. And this is essential to their worldview. There are all these people out there that are challenging the power of the elite. And if they get together, it's got to be stopped. Leo Strauss argued that what we need is propaganda. with propaganda, we can control the masses. Leo Strauss said that his favorite TV show was Gunsmoke, the cowboy TV show, where the good guy wears a white hat and is all good, not a single negative attribute. The bad guy wears a black hat and is all bad, not a single redeeming quality. The good guy always wins, the bad guy always loses. And Leo Strauss told his students, many of whom became neoconservative politicians, served in the Reagan administration and the Bush administration, that this is how average Americans should be cultivated to understand politics. We need dumbed down, stupid propaganda. Dumbed down, stupid propaganda for the masses. Make the masses brainwashed and controlled so they don't get together and trouble the elite. And that politics is about protecting the freedom of the elite from the persecution of the rabble. That is the belief that is at the center of neoconservatism. And oddly, that is also at the center of what you can call the synthetic left. In the 1950s, the CIA launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was all about funneling money to intellectuals who were left-wing and had a left-wing critique of U.S. society, but were anti-communist. And Susan Sontag and Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy and Herbert Marcuse, these individuals were subsidized as part of this program. And one of the main things that they did was reinterpret what fascism is. Now, the scientific Marxist understanding of fascism is rooted in the breakdown of capitalism. When the capitalist system enters a crisis, the capitalists fight with each other. One section of the capitalists seizes power and uses heavy-handed state measures and mobilizes the population to drive down living standards in an attempt to stabilize and end the capitalist crisis. Hitler did that. Mussolini did that. That's what it is. It's a form of capitalism in decay. I believe Lenin is widely quoted as saying, fascism is capitalism in decay. R. Palm Dutt, the Marxist and leader of the British Communist Party, wrote a great book, Fascism and Social Revolution. But Hannah Arendt and Susan Sontag, they had a very different definition of fascism. If you read Fascinating Fascism by Susan Sontag, the essay that she wrote for the New York Times Review of Books, if you read Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, suddenly fascism is not the problem of capitalism in decay. It is not a Bonapartist maneuver. It is not liberal Western capitalist societies collapsing into illiberalism amid an economic and political crisis. No, fascism is when the rabble get together. Fascism is when the inferior ones get together and start persecuting the great intellectuals. And communism, according to Susan Sontag, is just the most successful form of fascism. It's fascism with a human face, according to Susan Sontag. Fascism with a human face. Communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. And Saddam Hussein is a fascist. And Gaddafi is a fascist. And Fidel Castro is a fascist. And the West is great. Because with our liberal democratic system, we protect the intellectuals from the mob. This is the neoconservative view. This is the view of Leo Strauss. This is the view of Ayn Rand. This is the view of Nietzsche. And this is doctrinaire Satanism. It is anti-populism. At its core, it believes human beings are evil. Human beings are the problem. Oh, that's an interesting question. Trilateral Commission relate to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. That's actually a very good question, right? And it is a viewpoint that is fundamentally anti-human. Human beings are not animals. Let me repeat that. Human beings are not animals. This is something that is basically acknowledged in a very important essay by Frederick Engels called The Role of Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. And go and read it. It's a great essay by Frederick Engels about what makes humans different than any other species, right? What makes them different? Is it that humans have a civilization? Well, an ant farm is a civilization, right? Is it that, human beings use tools? Well, you can see different animals using tools. That happens, right? Is it that we have a language, we have a spoken language? Well, some people argue that some of the way animals communicate, they have a little bit of a language. It's not exactly a fully developed language. So what separates human beings from animals? The fundamental distinction between human beings and animals is that animals only interact with their environment. Humans make the environment serve them. They master the environment. And this is the fundamental difference. This is what Frederick Engels says. All other species only interact with their environment, but humans force the environment to serve them. They master the environment. And they constantly reinvent the way they interact with the environment. Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been building their beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. But in just 7,000 or 8,000 years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. There is something unique about mankind. Human beings have been endowed by their creator with some kind of special ability that makes them separate from other species. And philosophical, doctrinaire, ideological Satanism doesn't see it that way. Anton LaVey says, man is just another animal, sometimes better, but often worse than those that crawl on all fours. That's actually a literal quote from Anton LaVey, the Church of Satan founder, who recommends Ayn Rand. They see the world as a world of greed is good, might is right, selfishness. They see the law of the jungle as ideal. They see compassion as weakness. They see people working together in groups as dangerous and totalitarian. And this is classical doctrinaire Satanism. And it's an elitist worldview. It views some people as being naturally superior to others. It views the majority of mankind with contempt. It argues that there's this special group of people. There's a special group of people, and that this special group of people must rule over the rest of mankind, and that there needs to be all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that the rabble never get together and challenge the power of this special group of rulers. This is the satanic worldview. It's the John Galt speech. It's Leo Strauss. Susan Sontag. It's Ayn Rand. It's Nietzsche. It's anti-human. And it is really contrary to everything human beings have ever stood for. I'm not a huge fan of the U.S. Department of Justice. They need to free Alex Saab. They need to free Leonard Peltier. One time I was walking through the streets of Washington, D.C., and on the walls of the U.S. Department of Justice building, I saw a phrase. And the phrase was this. It said, where law stops, tyranny begins. Think about that. When law stops, tyranny begins. What does this mean? When law stops, tyranny begins. It doesn't make any sense. Isn't law a form of tyranny? You're telling people what to do. But think about it. Without law, it becomes the law of the jungle. And what is the law of the jungle? Might makes right. The strongest survive. And in our society, the strongest people are those who have the most money. Law and morality are the only things that protect the weak from the strong. Right? What stops if an old woman is crossing the street, two big strong guys want to run up to her and punch her in the face and take her purse? If there's no law, they can do it because they have the strength. But there is a law. We have laws against robbing people on the street. So the law protects her from the tyranny of those two guys who want to punch her and take her purse. What stops your boss from paying you 10 cents an hour? The law. The law says there's a minimum wage. And if it weren't for the law, you could get away with paying you that. And that's why workers have organized unions and fought for the law, fought for a minimum wage. The tyranny of your boss is restricted by the law. Now, we all know that in our society, the richest people manipulate the laws to serve their own ends, and that law under capitalism tends to serve the rich. But in a socialist society, we will have law, but it'll be a law of the people. It'll be the masses getting together and changing the law and taking control of the means of production and reorganizing society. But it won't be the abolition of law. It won't be going back to the rule of the jungle. It'll be the opposite. It'll be becoming even more civilized than capitalism. In capitalism, we have a law that is so ridiculous that Jeff Bezos can pay no taxes, and you and me are paying a decent amount of taxes. That's ridiculous. Well, in a socialist society, the rich won't be writing the laws anymore. It'll be the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? We live under the dictatorship of capitalists. Socialism begins with the dictatorship of the proletariat, with the broad masses of people rising up and taking control of the means of production, reorganizing society, taking control of the state. Socialism is not dismantling civilization and returning to the law of the jungle. No. Socialism is rising to a higher stage of civilization. It's taking what's special about human beings, that we don't have the law of the jungle, we have actual laws, that we reinvent the way we interact with our environment, that we're constantly going to a higher stage of development. It's taking that to a higher level. It's abolishing the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market, having a rationally planned economy so we can get to a society with so much abundance that inequality can fade away. And the state itself and the law and all these things we've invented to try and make the best of a world full of scarcity can fade away. That is the idea. But the belief that human beings are naturally barbarians, the belief that it's just law of the jungle and might makes right, the belief that there's some people that are just superior to others and they need to be protected from the rabble, the belief that mankind, the mass majority of human beings are deep down ugly people, are ugly, dangerous people. That is doctrinaire Satanism. It's the oligarchical view of mankind. It is the anti-human view. And I would say that is the prevailing view. It's the view of the synthetic left. It's the view of the right wing. It's the view of the neoconservative right and of the synthetic left. The neoconservative right, their view is that capitalism, American capitalism, is the greatest system. The people who work the hardest and are the smartest are the richest. And governments around the world that challenge U.S. imperialism are all societies where the mob, the rabble, has risen up and taken control of the government. So the USA needs to spread freedom around the world by attacking and beating down these governments so they can have societies like we have here, where the elite, the best, the greatest rise to the top, and the rabble are held back. That is what neocons believe. That is what neoconservatives believe. That's why they justified the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That's why they wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. This is what neocons believe. The American system is ideal because the elite rise to the top, because the rabble aren't able to get together and restrict the freedom of the elite, and that we want to spread, we want to have a global movement to spread this great American system around the world so the elite can always be protected and the rabble can never get together and restrain the great man. That is what neoconservatives believe. That's what Irving Kristol taught. That's what Leo Strauss taught. That's the neocon belief, and it is satanic. What does the synthetic left believe? The synthetic left believes that whenever people march in uniform, whenever people have a collective goal or a collective vision, whenever there is, talk of populism or people coming together and fighting for a cause, this is fascism. That it's the red-brown alliance. If communists, want to fight for class struggle, that's class reductionism. It's populism. It's crypto-Trumpism. It's Nazbolism. It's red-brown. Right? That fascism is not the breakdown of capitalism. They reject Marxian materialism. They reject class struggle. They are fighting for the elite to be able to live their lives however they want, and they are fighting for the rabble to be manipulated. The greatest enemy is Putin. The greatest enemy is China. The greatest enemy is Venezuela. And the United States with its universities, and Facebook and Twitter with their social engineering and their free expression that's maneuvered and manipulated to brainwash you for the elite. That is the expression of freedom. That's what the synthetic left believes. This is the ideology, ideological Satanism, the oligarchical view of mankind, capitalist ideology. That's what essentially this is. Liberalism, you can call it doctrinaire liberalism. This is the prevailing view in our world. This is what Wall Street believes. This is what London believes. This is what Paris believes. This is what the German bankers believe. This is what the London Stock Exchange promotes. This is what they teach at Harvard. This is what they teach at Yale. This is what they teach at business schools. This is what they teach with, this is what they teach. This is what they believe. Individualism above all else. Might is right. Rule of the jungle. This is what they believe. It calls itself anti-totalitarianism. It calls itself liberalism. It calls itself human rights. It calls itself the Western beliefs, the Western civilization. This is what is central to the worldview of those who dominate the world, and it is very, very, very dangerous. And the final type of Satanism that I want to talk about, we've gone over constructive Satanism, which is challenging the power structure, holding us accountable. We've gone over teenage Satanism, which is just contrarianism, rebellion, childish adolescent rebellion, contrarianism, etc. We've gone over ideological and philosophical Satanism, which is the prevailing viewpoint of our society. But now I want to get to the fourth part, the fourth kind. And I don't quite know what to call this fourth form of Satanism, because it's a very sly form of Satanism. It's not blatant, but it's within all of us. It is the part of yourself that is working against you. It is something that exists in every individual. It's that thing that gets in your way. It's that voice in your head that says there is no hope. It's that voice in your head when your alarm goes off in the morning and you want to go and have your day that says, what's the point? There's no hope. Everyone's against you. It's that voice in your head when you get a plan, you get an idea of how you can move ahead in life, how you can go accomplish something, how you can get involved in a political organization, how you can do something creative that says, everyone's going to laugh at you. That's stupid. you'll never succeed. It's that part of you that says there's no reason to get up in the morning. There is no hope. You have no future. You have no value. No one cares about you. You're on your own. Your life sucks. Your life is pointless. It's that part of you that in some cases drives people to suicide, that drives people to become drug addicts and try to silence that voice with drugs. In some cases, it's the voice of an abusive parent. In some cases, it's the voice of an abusive partner. In some cases, it's the result of traumatic and painful experiences. In some cases, it's the result of just hostile conditions that have made it much harder. We all have a part of this. There's a little bit of this in all of us. It's not a constructive voice saying you could do better in this area. It's not constructive Satanism. It's not telling you to improve. It's not giving constructive criticism. No. On top of that, it's not adolescent rebellion. It's not encouraging you to break with social norms, to fight with people, to challenge status quo in kind of a juvenile, shallow, contrarian way. It's not that. It's not doctrinaire Satanism, contempt for humanity, elitism, anti-populism. It's not that. It is a destructive piece of your soul. It is something within your psyche that is trying to kill you, that is trying to tear you down. It's pessimism. It's hopelessness. It's depression. And that is the fourth type of Satanism. And the first type of Satanism, we need that. We need that. We need constructive challenging. But the other three, we need to battle against. We need to battle against adolescent, Oedipal, rebellion, and strive to have real politics. We need to battle against the oligarchical view of mankind, the anti-populism, the ideology of liberalism, the might is right anti-collectivism. And we ultimately need to battle against the destructive impulse within ourselves. Toxic shame is what Turbo GG is calling it. Whatever it is that is pushing that fourth form of Satanism in your life, wherever it came from, whether it came from just the chemicals in your brain, traumatic experiences, abuse, wherever it came from, probably the best cure for it is other people. In fact, the reason, that's interesting. The reason that there's so much of that fourth form of Satanism, that toxic shame, that pessimism floating around, is because people are more isolated than ever before. Human beings are not supposed to be able to fight against that stuff on their own. Human beings need other people. Human beings need other people. From the time we were hunter-gatherers in the woods all the way up to today, we've always been collective creatures. And any person that you put on their own, alone, isolated, is going to start feeling this way. There's an infamous study by Piaget where there were babies and they gave them food, they fed them, but they didn't give them any love. They didn't give them any affection. No one held them, and they all died. It's a very infamous study. They isolated these newborn babies, and they fed them. They had an adult feed them, but then go away from them. And they isolated these newborn babies, and they all died. Human beings cannot live in a state of isolation. They can't. Human beings need other human beings. And it's with other human beings, with the strength of other human beings, working together with other human beings for a goal, studying with other human beings, working together, building off of other people's strength, working as part of a team, interacting with other human beings, growing through our interactions with other human beings. This is how human beings are able to be healthy. It's how they're able to make that pessimism within themselves go away. It's the way they're able to kill that hopelessness, that depression within themselves. And so, in a weird way, the first form of Satanism and the second form of Satanism and the third form of Satanism is connected to the fourth. They're all connected. They're all connected in their one way or another. They're all connected in one way or another. They're all rooted in how we interact with people. We need to learn to tolerate criticism. We need to learn to have atmospheres in our organizations and our communities and our relationships where people feel free to criticize, where mistakes can be pointed out, where no one's afraid to get up and say the emperor has no clothes and the emperor doesn't end up walking around naked because no one can criticize him. We need to learn to tolerate constructive Satanism. 2, we need to struggle against the teenage adolescent rebellion. We need to struggle against rebellion for rebellion's sake. We need to struggle against, screw you, mom and dad, I won't clean my room. We need to struggle against that. 3rd, we need to absolutely wage an ideological and political battle against anti-populism and liberalism and the oligarchical view of mankind, the capitalist ideology, whether it comes from Ayn Rand, from Friedrich Nietzsche, whether it comes from Leo Strauss or Irving Kristol, whether it comes from ContraPoints or Vosch, wherever it comes from, Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy, wherever the oligarchical view of mankind is espoused, we need to struggle against it. And 4thly, we need to be there for each other. We need to build communities for each other. We need to care for each other and support each other and build combinations, organizations to support each other, to suppress that isolated, pessimistic, hopeless voice within ourselves. And that is my opening remarks, my presentation on the 4 forms of Satanism. This is probably the first time in your life you've ever heard a Marxist analysis of Satanism and the 4 forms of it, and I just gave it to you. And that concludes my opening remarks. Thank you, everybody. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you, and we'll do our roll call, and then we'll start doing super chats. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Who is with us? All righty. All right. We got Balthazar in Oakland. We got Rice from Australia. We got Port Huron, AG. Please, anyone can clip these streams. If you liked something I did tonight, clip it out and post it. Please, by any means, do it. Anyone can clip these streams. We got Brisbane, Australia. We got Christian in Bergen County. We got Joe P from South New Jersey. We got Bradley Wasser in St. Louis. We got Chauncey in Milwaukee. We got Jamie in St. Paul. Gabby Hernandez in Chicago. Marissa in Washington State. Anthony in Detroit. Glenn in Portland. Jacob in Wisconsin. St. David's in Bermuda. Restless Native. Sue from Rhode Island. Benson, North Carolina. Adam in Salt Lake City. Binghamton, New York. Love Blind Hate. We got Dob Hobb in Atlanta. Yada Yisrael from Chicago. We got Ben from 139th and Broadway, NYC. Wow. We got Newton Grove, North Carolina, Donnie Wallace. We got Dan Keating from New Jersey. We got Guam, Hattori from Guam. We got Newton Grove, Donnie Wallace. We got Isaac in Vancouver. We got Chaya from Montreal. We got Novato from Jenny from Novato, California. What else we got here? We got Sean from Phoenix, Arizona. We got Sabre from Atlanta. Steve in Reno. Steve and Anna in Ringgold, Georgia. We got Fukuyama, Japan. We got Carter from Duluth, Minnesota. We got Alex from Brazil. We got Greenwood Lake. We got Isaiah in Dallas. Yuri from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Colin from Greensboro. Arizona, Michael Pano from Arizona. We got Clinton, North Carolina. We got rural Iceland, or someone from rural Iceland. We got Micah from Las Vegas, Clive from Australia. We got Emperor Tanky in Massachusetts. Johnsy from the East Village. Greenville, South Carolina. Ian Nix. We got Daniela from Ecuador. We got Jenny Lynn from Cincinnati, Ohio. We got Infinite Cosmos, Jerry from the Infinite Cosmos. We got Miami Baby, Audible, very, very good. Colorful Colorado, Theo, very, very good stuff, folks. Very, very good stuff. Very good stuff, folks. Good times, everybody. Great times. Good stuff. I'm so glad to be streaming with all of you. Kieran from San Diego sends a super chat. Very good. Tim from La Junta. Very, very good. Very, very good, folks. I am so glad to be engaging with all of you. We've already got a few super chats, but if there's something you want me to talk about here tonight, shoot me a super chat and I will try to give you an answer. So there you go. Wow. Sammy says, you never know how timely your talk was for me. I've been feeling really, thank you, Caleb. All right. Well, glad you liked it, Sammy. I have different topics. Sometimes we talk about the news. Sometimes we get into Marxist politics. But there you go. All right. All right. Very, very good. JC from Portland, Oregon. Dario from Brooklyn. Good stuff. Good stuff. All righty. All righty. All right. So the first question is from Chaya. Chaya asks, would I interview anyone from the Starbucks or Amazon union? The answer is yes and yes. If you know somebody, I would be happy to have somebody from either of those unions on my show. If Chris Smalls came on this show, I would be honored. I mean, he went on Jimmy Dore already and did awesome. He went on Tucker Carlson, and that was awesome. Who you voted for in each general election. I'll write it down. Who you voted for in each general election. All righty. We'll get to that when we get to that. But yes, the answer is I would love to have them on. I would love to have them on. I would totally love to have them on. Totally would love to have them on. Good stuff, folks. All righty. Next question. The economic freedom fighters in South Africa and socialism in Angola. So in South Africa, you had the apartheid government, the white supremacist apartheid regime that existed. That fell in the early 90s. Apartheid was toppled thanks to great progressive struggles from around the world. And let's remember that Nelson Mandela, the hero of the struggle against apartheid, was a tankie. He was an admirer of Gaddafi. He was an admirer of Fidel Castro, an admirer of Stalin. And on top of that, Nelson Mandela, he was declared a terrorist by the U.S. government. The African National Congress, the ANC, was declared a terrorist organization by the U.S. government. You can look that up. That's why I told Vosh that he would have punched Nelson Mandela in the face, because he says that anybody who supports Stalin, anyone who supports Mao, anyone who supports North Korea or Gaddafi is a Nazi. And I said, that's Nelson Mandela you're talking about. And that's why anyone who repeats this anti-tanky shit, they're against Nelson Mandela, and they're against Albert Einstein, and they're against all kinds of progressive people. And the struggle to bring down apartheid was a communist progressive struggle, if ever. Now, eventually a division opened up in the ruling class, but it was originally only communists that marched against apartheid. And the African National Congress got guns and weapons from the Soviet Union. They engaged in armed struggle, and they fought against apartheid. And the U.S. government called them terrorists and backed the apartheid regime. And these are facts. Now, in the early 90s, you have to remember the Soviet Union fell. And there was hope that South Africa would become a socialist country. When the Soviet Union was falling, as apartheid was also falling, it became clear that South Africa wasn't going to be able to go all the way to socialism. But regardless, I mean, South Africa, they were the first country in the world to put LGBT rights into their constitution. They were, they have a very strong trade union, COSATU, it's called. And the biggest faction within the African National Congress was the South African Communist Party. But, they didn't go all the way to socialism. And that this is something that happens. And many people have talked about this. So on the one hand, it's a question of political line, right? That there were a lot of people in the African National Congress who didn't really believe in communism. They were against apartheid. They were fighting for black rights against apartheid. The Soviet Union was on their side. The Communist Party was part of it. There are a lot of people in the ANC who, communism was there. They weren't against it, but it wasn't really a big deal to them. But on top of that, the Soviet Union fell. So the Soviet Union fell, and communism as a movement was getting weaker. Plus, you had a big chunk of people in the South African, ANC, who didn't really believe in communism. And so those people, those elements that didn't really believe in communism, got stronger because the world seemed to be going their way. And this is one thing that always happens, okay? So, people want to make it out like it's all politics. Well, it's not all politics. It's not all politics, right? People want to make it that simple, right? Hostile circumstances push revisionist elements to the front. This is a fact. When circumstances are against victories for the working class, revisionist elements come to the front. And the problem with revisionist elements is fundamentally their ideas. That's true. But because you can't win victories with correct actions, it's harder to distinguish revisionism from a correct line. And this happens. When the economy is booming in the United States, the politics of the left go crazy because average Americans don't want to hear it, right? The working class movement in the United States, the biggest strike in history, in U.S. history, I believe, was in 1877, the railroad workers' strike. And that was a huge strike and didn't win anything. All they got out of it was the, I'm sorry. All right. That's an interesting one. Peter. Going. And there was a socialist movement starting in the United States. But as we know, in the 1880s and the 1890s, imperialism was in ascendancy. The USA, just like the rest of the Western capitalist world, was transitioning from regular industrial capitalism to imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And that involved the stratification of the working class. It involved super profits. It involved all of that. And so you'll notice that in the 1890s, in the aftermath of the huge strike, the railroad workers' strike, that the Marxist movement in the United States started going in weird directions. Samuel Gompers was the founder of the American Federation of Labor. He was originally a Marxist. But when imperialism was in ascendancy and living standards were rising and the working class was being stratified, he ultimately embraced U.S. imperialism. He embraced U.S. imperialism, embraced business unionism, abandoned Marxism, became a labor faker, a reformist, embraced racism in the labor movement. Samuel Gompers, in response to hostile circumstances, his revisionist ideas made more sense. And among other elements, there was a rise in ultra-leftism. Daniel DeLeon was a great American Marxist agitator and organizer. But in the hostile circumstances of the 1880s, 1890s, Daniel DeLeon became a crazed ultra-leftist and said he opposed all unions that weren't socialist. He took positions that he was opposed to the breaking up the big monopolies because it would be easier to nationalize them after the revolution. And his organization, the Socialist Labor Party, degenerated into an ultra-leftist sect that was isolated from the masses because of hostile circumstances. There was a strand of terrorists that developed. I believe President McKinley, was assassinated by an anarchist. The anarchist was so angry about seeing what was happening to the people of the Philippines that he killed the president, engaged in ultra-left adventurous terrorism. None of these were what needed to be done. What needed to be done was building a mass working class movement. And that's what eventually happened. Eugene Debs and the Wobblies did that. But in the period in the 1890s, 1910, up to the period of the 1890s, up to 1903, 1904, imperialism was an ascendancy and it was a hostile circumstance. So bad political lines became dominant. In a lot of cases, bad revisionist political lines are based on trying to accomplish things. It's based on trying to feel like you're getting something done in a circumstance where it's hard to get something done. What does all this have to do with South Africa? So in South Africa, you had Nelson Mandela and his movement was gaining, and the Soviet Union was backing them, and apartheid fell, but then the Soviet Union fell, and neoliberalism was rising around the world. And so hostile circumstances developed. If they had gone all the way to socialism in South Africa in the early 90s, there would have been a civil war. The USA would have backed and armed the white settlers and farmers, and there wouldn't have been any Soviet Union to come aid, the people of South Africa. And so the elements that said, well, we just got to accommodate with capitalism, they won out. And at the same time, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Northern Ireland, right? The IRA was dominated by Marxists and revolutionaries, but the Soviet Union that had been backing the IRA and Sinn Féin, Soviet Union fell. And so the element in Sinn Féin that wanted to just sign a treaty, they came to dominate. And the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Right? And that this is what happened. So the way South Africa is today, not a socialist country, a country where apartheid has been defeated, that is good, but a country where there's still vast amounts of inequality, where the land is not owned by the black people, where, there's still a lot of, impoverishment on the part of some people, a lot of wealth in the hands of white farmers, etc. These circumstances are very much the result of the fact that the Soviet Union fell around the same time that apartheid was being overturned. And because of that, there's still a lot of unrest in South Africa. And there's many people in South Africa that used to be in the African National Congress or the Communist Party that feel that the ANC has sold out. And they argue that the correct thing to do is form a new party, the Economic Freedom Fighters. And they present themselves as being more radical than the ANC. However, there are elements that are hardline and tanky and communist who their view is that the ANC can still be salvaged. So I don't take sides in that split. I think that there are good communists that are working within the ANC to try to push the ANC to be more revolutionary. And I think there are good communists that are pushing the Economic Freedom Fighters to be more radical and join the Economic Freedom Fighters. I don't take sides. I support both of them. My hope is that eventually the communists of South Africa can be in one party, not two. And my hope is that the communists of South Africa can get South Africa on the road to socialism. And with China's support, the Belt and Road Initiative, they can become more anti-imperialist and more a part of the socialist camp. Like Angola. Angola was an African country that almost immediately after they got their independence in 1975, the U.S. imperialists started fomenting civil war. They backed UNITA, a group of crazy extremists led by a literal cannibal. A literal cannibal named Jonas Savimbi was armed by the United States, went around terrorizing people and murdering people. And, there was war for decades and decades. Cuba sent its military to Angola to stand with them when the apartheid government of South Africa invaded Angola. It wasn't until 2002 that Angola got peace. And once Angola got peace, they started to have some of the highest economic growth rates in the world with their oil and with their state-controlled, oil company. They built Luanda into a beautiful city. and they gave a lot of people their first job. They raised people out of poverty. China went in there and built railroads. They paved roads for the country. They did things that, yes, Angola is such a poor country that to us, it's like, what? Who cares? But for people who never had a paved road in their neighborhood, it was a really big deal. For people who'd never had access to running water or the right to, the ability to have a school to go to learn to read and write, what was accomplished in Angola in the early parts of the 21st century was very, very amazing. Some of the highest economic growth rates in the world because with China's help and state-controlled oil resources, the socialist government, the MPLA, was, having programs to raise people out of poverty. However, the oil prices dropped in 2014. There was an economic crisis, and that pushed forward revisionist elements. And Isabel dos Santos, who was very much a socialist, she's the richest woman in Africa, but she's a socialist, and she's pro-China, and she's pro-Russia, and she's revolutionary. She was forced out of the government, and the CIA and their allies in Angola forced Isabel dos Santos out of the government. The current leader of Angola is a guy who is much more in favor of neoliberalism, who wants to dismantle the state-run oil company, but he's not able to completely do it, right? Because there's a whole party underneath him, the MPLA. So I'm not a big fan of the current president of Angola. However, I do think that Angola remains a socialist country, largely. But there is leadership there that is trying to dismantle that socialism. Hard times create strong men create good times. Do you agree with this quote? No, not really. I don't. Why don't if there's a way I can cut and paste that would be easier than, all right, let's see if I can. All right, can I cut and paste that? Do I have to type all of that out? Oy, oy, oy. All right, here we go. All right, copy. All right, let's see if I can. All right. All right, very good. Okay. All right. Sorry. That's a long quote you want me to read off, but that's okay. All right, very good. Okay. Cut and paste your quote, and I will answer that super chat. All righty. So, Angola, again, the foundations of a socialist economy are there. At this point, I think they have a leadership that's embracing neoliberalism, that wants to basically dismantle their socialist system. But at the same time, the foundations are still there. It's complicated. And that's what a lot of people seem to not realize is that the very clear line between capitalism and socialism is not always there. There's a line between imperialism and anti-imperialism. That line is there. The line between anti-imperialism and socialism is not always clear. Anti-imperialism and imperialism is there. The imperialists don't want the MPLA in power in Angola, but they like the guy who's in power now, that he's somebody who's much more friendly to the imperialists. They were happy to see Isabel dos Santos ousted from the government, but they still don't like the MPLA. They still want neoliberalism in Angola. There you go. All right. Did the CIA's illegal opium trade in the Golden Triangle find a legal avenue with Big Pharma? Is the latest opioid crisis an example of drugs as weapons? All right. Trade. Pharma is opium crisis an example of drugs as weapons? All right. Very good. Next question. Satanic Temple came out in support of Ukraine. Shocker. Shocker. Again, the actual Church of Satan, Satanic Temple, groups like that, those groups are big supporters of capitalism. They're big supporters of the free market. They promote Ayn Rand. They hate Russia. They hate tyranny. It is very much this kind of, they're libertarian in their philosophy. So the fact that they would be, rallying around Western capitalism's aligned regime as it is fighting against Russia, a major anti-imperialist state, that makes perfect sense. All right. Transnistria could require Russian intervention. I really hope that this war does not expand. I really hope it doesn't expand. It's the last thing the world needs right now. But I think Russia does not want to expand this war. They would only do so if the imperialists force it. And again, the imperialists are catching the world on fire. How much longer are the imperialists going to keep this going? How many more people have to die so they can drive the price of oil up, so they can drive the price of food up, so they can make money for their weapons contractors, so they can beat down Russia and try to control Russia? This is insane. These imperialists are out of their minds. They are out of their minds, and it's dangerous what they're doing. And you have to wonder how long before people that are in their alliance start feeling the effects of what they're doing and saying, we're not on board. How long until the Germans start backing away from this? How long until the French start backing away from this? How long until people within the imperialist own alliance start feeling the effects of the global crisis they're fomenting, and back away? There you go. Does psychoanalysis have any value? Well, this is actually, it's funny. Jordan Peterson is an awful person, in my opinion. Jordan Peterson should never open his mouth when he's talking about communism. He knows absolutely nothing about what he's talking about. And his debate with Slavoj Žižek was embarrassing, and it was painful. And a lot of what Jordan Peterson says is just standard clinical psychology. Anyone who goes to university and studies psychology will know the stuff he says, right? And a lot of it has this weird right-wing, stodgy, anti-feminist edge to it, but it's just kind of standard psychology with his political bias mixed in. However, there is one thing Jordan Peterson has said that I do agree with, and it's this. Sigmund Freud has been done a raw deal. The way we think about Sigmund Freud is not fair. It's not fair to Freud. Now, it's not to say Sigmund Freud was good. Sigmund Freud, in a lot of ways, was a sexual predator. He was a con artist. He was manipulative. He was bad in a lot of ways, okay? So I'm not defending Freud. I'm not a Freudian, and I'm not defending Freud. But history and popular culture have been unfair to Sigmund Freud for this reason. Everything that we associate with Sigmund Freud sounds wackadoo, right? We all secretly want to have sex with our parents. We fear that our fathers are going to castrate us. Penis envy on the part of women. All of the stuff we associate with Freud sounds cuckoo. However, all the things that Freud thought of that no one had ever thought of before, everyone takes for granted. No one gives him credit for. There were a lot of things that Freud wrote down and said that are now considered widely accepted. They're widely accepted concepts in popular culture that we don't give him any credit for. So he's been done a raw deal, right? Yes, he said all the cuckoo shit. You want to have sex with your mother, and you're afraid your father's going to cut your penis off, and women all want to have a penis, and he did cocaine, and he thought therapists should sleep with their clients. He was bad in a lot of ways. Okay, I'll give you that, and you're absolutely right. But we only know half the story. No one had ever talked about the subconscious mind before. No one had ever talked about that. The fact that there's a lot going on in your head that is not your conscious thoughts. There's a lot of feelings, emotions, memories that you're not aware of. Well, now everybody knows that. We know that. Duh. Well, Freud thought of that. No one had ever said that before Sigmund Freud. The idea, this is commonly accepted, that in your romantic partner, you often look for attributes that you see in the parent of the opposite sex. Right? That's true. A lot of people admit, that women will often look for traits in a man that are traits that is in their father. Men will often look in a romantic partner for traits that are in their mother. Now, it's not completely true, but there's a huge element of truth in that. No one had ever thought of that until Sigmund Freud showed up. Right? All of this stuff, a lot of things that we just take for granted now, Freud thought of, and we don't give him any credit for that. We just think it's common sense. It's like, duh, of course you have a subconscious. Duh, of course, you want a romantic partner that's similar to your parent of the opposite sex. Duh, there's a rivalry between teenage boys and their fathers, right? Duh. I mean, no one says, we all assume that everybody knows that. Everybody does not know that. When Freud said it, no one had ever said it before. Well, he deserves credit for that. But he also deserves to be pointed out that he used his position as a therapist to get women into bed. And he knew he was doing that. His concept, he discovered, he invented talk therapy. Talk therapy. No one had ever done that before. The closest thing to talk therapy that had ever existed had been confession, the rite of confession in the Catholic Church, which is not therapy. I mean, you go in, you confess your sin, the priest forgives you, whatever. It's not the same thing. But Freud developed talk therapy. Well, now talk therapy is very widely used, and most people who do it don't like Freud. But no one had ever done that before. Talk therapy was invented by Freud. Do we give him any credit for that? No. So this guy invented talk therapy. Big discovery. Discovered the concept of the subconscious mind. Discovered all kinds of concepts that are now widely in the culture. He deserves credit for that. However, one thing that Sigmund Freud discovered, and this is why I think he was not a good person. Sigmund Freud, when he was giving people talk therapy, psychoanalysis, he called it, he discovered that when you give someone talk therapy, which he invented, they will start to view you in place of their parent. That's true. That the way a child listens to the parent and idealizes the parent, the patient will put on to the therapist. And that gives the therapist a huge amount of power, right? Often the patient, the client in psychotherapy or whatever, will go out of their way to try and please the therapist. Right? If the therapist says they disapprove of something they're doing, the person will change. Sigmund Freud discovered this, and he wrote about this. He talked about transference. It was one of his biggest concepts. And he also used it to get women into bed. He also basically said, wow, these women are seeing me in place of their parent. They're looking up to me the way a child looks up to their father. I can get me some sex out of this. That's fucked. That is really predatory behavior. Nowadays, a therapist that does that would lose their license and possibly go to jail, right? But Freud invented it. There were no therapy ethics back then because Freud was Freud. Freud also, he was very much about manipulating people for money, but anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. Freud doesn't deserve credit. Freud deserves credit for a lot that he doesn't get credit for, but yeah, he wasn't a good dude. But a lot of his concepts are very insightful. He was a very smart, bad dude. How's that? I mean, his worldview is fundamentally wrong. I mean, if you read Civilization and Its Discontents, that book basically is an anti-human book. It views human beings as animals. It says civilization isn't really worth it. It mocks love your neighbor as yourself and says it's impossible because how could you possibly feel what someone else feels? So there's really no point, and that just produces a huge amount of guilt. Freud is not a good dude, but in his not goodness, he had a lot of very interesting insights into how do people think, into how human minds work, into how human relationships work. He was a very smart, not good dude with a lot of interesting insights into how people work. And so, I think you can draw a lot from psychoanalysis, but that doesn't mean that you have to like the guy, because the guy who invented it was not a good dude, but it's kind of like biology, right? What if Gregor Mendel was a bad guy? Does that mean we throw out psychology? No, right? What if Darwin was a bad guy? Does that mean we throw out biology? No, right? That, bad people can discover good things. I ride in cars, even though Henry Ford was not a good dude. Okay. And that's kind of the point, right? I'm talking to you over an Apple computer. That doesn't mean I support Steve Jobs, right? That often bad people can invent or develop things that are good or useful, right? And I think that a lot of what Freud discovered was useful. I think Freud's fundamental worldview is reactionary. And in my book on Kamala Harris, I extensively quote from Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud, which is a really interesting book in what it says. But the message of the book is fundamentally opposed to me, what I stand for. I think what he advocates and believes in that book is fundamentally wrong. All right, next question. How does the Trilateral Commission relate to the Congress for Cultural Freedom? Not really. They're two separate things. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was a CIA program started in 1949. In 1949, the CIA started funneling money to leftists, left-wing academics, Trotskyites, and others, people that were socialists but anti-communist, to publish magazines and articles and books that were cultural criticism, that were, critical of McCarthyism, criticizing the Cold War, but also very anti-communist. That's what the Congress for Cultural Freedom was. And it started Paris Review. It started, Encounter magazine in Britain. It started Partisan Review in the United States, Der Monat magazine in Germany. That's where the Frankfurt School comes out of, the Frankfurt School. That's what the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was. It was an attempt to subsidize and promote the work of anti-communist Marxists in order to defeat the Soviet Union. That's what that was. Well, and, in the 60s, it was revealed that it was funded by the CIA, and it was pretty much done at that point. That's that, right? The Trilateral Commission was a think tank started by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. And it was after the USA lost the Vietnam War. These two big U.S. foreign policy strategists, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, got a lot of money from the Rockefellers. It wasn't funded by the government, I don't believe. I believe it was a private money from the Rockefeller family, David Rockefeller and others, funded a think tank to just come together and rethink U.S. foreign policy, rethink the global economy, rethink a lot of things. And the Trilateral Commission produced a huge amount of documents. They were really into overpopulation, the concept of overpopulation. They were really into the idea that democracy and political involvement on the part of the masses might get in the way of the free market, that in order to defeat communism, we may have to move against democracy. The Trilateral Commission was this ruling class think tank, Brzezinski and Kissinger, and they got together and they came out with a lot of documents about how to reinvent U.S. foreign policy after the defeat in Vietnam. So these are two separate entities. How are they created? How are they connected? Well, the Rockefellers also funded the the Congress for Cultural Freedom. A lot of Rockefeller think tanks gave money to the Congress for Cultural Freedom in addition to the CIA. So that's a connection, right? The CIA was also kind of taking guidance and reading and engaging with what the Henry Kissinger's Zbigniew Brzezinski documents were saying. So there's that. They're both anti-democratic. They both view the broad masses of people as the enemy. They both have that oligarchical view of mankind that I talk about. Both very anti-communist, but in kind of a liberal, progressive, veneer. So they're similar, but they're two different things. The Trilateral Commission was in the 1970s. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was in the 1950s. All right, next question. All right. How have you voted in each general election? I don't know if I should answer that or not. Right? Because I do work as a journalist. And as a journalist, you're not supposed to do that. And that would bias my reporting. I will tell you that before I could vote, I campaigned for John Kerry. When I was in high school, I campaigned for John Kerry. And at the time, I was reading a lot of the newspapers and the writings of the RCP. And I lived in my little town in Ohio. And I volunteered for the John Kerry campaign because I hated George W. Bush and because it was something I could do. I was 14. They didn't have a communist party in my little town. Didn't have a socialist party in my little town. If I wanted to do anything communist or socialist, it had to either be on the internet or, in my little town. And there was a small group of people. There was a very, very small group of people who were campaigning for John Kerry. And so based on that, I went to the county fair and I went up to people and tried to get them to read information about John Kerry. I look back on that. It was something to do. And I mean, again, I was able to, I went up to people and sold them buttons and, I don't know, talked to younger people about the danger of a draft. I mean, did it accomplish very much? No. Not really, but it was something I could do. That election in 2004 was a weird moment. It was a weird moment, right? 2004, George W. Bush had been president. He was running for re-election. The war in Iraq was quite unpopular, and George W. Bush was associated with suppression of civil liberties and torture. He was associated with, regime change wars. He was associated with government wiretapping. He was associated with neoliberalism. He was associated with the religious right and the fanatical religious stuff. And the John Kerry campaign became kind of a catch-all for anyone who was against it. Libertarians were campaigning for John Kerry. Far left socialists were campaigning for John Kerry. And one memory that I distinctly have, it sticks in my mind, was in 2004. My dad and I went to Kent State University, which was near where I grew up, in this huge auditorium. It was like thousands of people to see Michael Moore speak. Michael Moore, the guy who made Fahrenheit 9/11, the guy who made Bowling for Columbine and Sicko, and this left-wing filmmaker who's, kind of a socialist, kind of social democratic, pro-Cuba, but, he goes back and forth. Now at this point, he's just a stupid Democrat. But if you go especially back into the 90s, he was saying more socialistic things. One thing I remember was this rally that I went to. It was a Michael Moore rally, and Roseanne Barr was there, which is kind of hilarious. See where she's gone, right? She was for Trump, and she got her show banned for all of that. And Roseanne Barr was there. Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine was there. And Michael Moore spoke for like 2 hours. He showed clips. It was entertainment. And what I remember was that that was an anti-capitalist rally. It was not a rally to vote for John Kerry. People thought Bush was capitalism. It was a rally for workers' rights. I don't know. Never met him. I'll write it down. Mark's a butthead. It was a rally for workers' rights. It was a rally for, free health care for all. It was a rally for, it was a rally against the wars. It was a rally for socialism, basically. But instead of saying the problem is capitalism, they were saying the problem is Bush. It was very, very weird, because I look back on that. There were basically two campaigns. There was the John Kerry campaign, and there was the Michael Moore campaign. John Kerry went around saying things that leftists didn't agree with. John Kerry's platform was to send more troops to Iraq. That was actually his platform. That is actually what he wanted. He wanted to send more troops to Iraq. John Kerry had been the leader of Vietnam veterans against the war, but his whole campaign was not about how he had protested the Vietnam War. His whole campaign was about how he had been a hero in Vietnam, and he got medals, and he, it was a military hero. John Kerry's whole campaign was a military campaign. He actually, on the acceptance stage at the Democratic National Convention in 2004, he actually accepted by saying, "This is John Kerry reporting for duty." His whole campaign, whenever John Kerry went anywhere, he gave pro-war speeches. He said, and first of all, he was also the most boring speaker ever. And he would talk like this. And in the most boring voice you've ever heard. I am John Kerry, and I am so boring. It was so boring, so boring. And I remember that in, many of his speeches, especially towards the end of his campaign, he said, "I was against going into Iraq to begin with, but now we have to follow the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, You buy it. You break it, it's yours. That was his argument. We invaded Iraq, so therefore we had to keep occupying Iraq. You break it, it's yours. His platform called for a massive escalation of the war in Iraq. John Kerry was against gay marriage. John Kerry was, he was everything that all these people at this Michael Moore rally were against. And so John Kerry was there running his campaign, and Michael Moore was going around riling up the kind of people that would vote for Bernie. And much of Michael Moore's speech was telling people they were bad if they voted for Ralph Nader. I remember that. He went on for hours. Not hours, but went on for quite some time in his speech criticizing anyone who would vote for Ralph Nader. It was this anybody but Bush message. Michael Moore actually endorsed, at first he wasn't supporting John Kerry. He was supporting General Wesley Clark, who bombed Serbia. And Michael Moore was basically going around getting socialists and leftists to vote for John Kerry. And John Kerry was going around telling the people voting for him to be more pro-military. The whole thing was weird. It was like the whole campaign was almost a psyop. The country was against the war. The country was against the torture. The country was against the military-industrial complex. And the candidate was going around telling people how pro-war he was. And the candidate was going around saying he wanted to send more troops to Iraq. And the candidate was boring. And it was weird. It was really weird. And then Michael Moore was going around and talking about how, like, defeating Bush will be the beginning of the revolution. It was very weird. It was very, very weird. The whole thing was a very, very strange campaign. It was a very, very strange campaign. And ultimately, Kerry almost won that election. And the reason that he won is that his own campaign strategy backfired. Throughout the campaign, John Kerry was going around not talking about being an anti-war activist, not talking about how he had, protested the war when he came back from Vietnam, playing up that he was a war hero. They made a documentary film all about what a war hero John Kerry was. And the film was disgusting pro-imperialist propaganda. John Kerry was on a boat. He was on a boat in Vietnam going up and down the rivers, and he would shoot communists, teenagers, 13-year-old kids who were fighting for their homeland, fighting for Vietnam to be free from U.S. imperialism. And John Kerry sat on a boat with a gun, and he would shoot them from his boat. And he was supposed to be a hero for doing that. It was disgusting. That's not heroism. All right? I support our military people. I think that, so they're some of the most important anti-war voices. But I'm sorry, but there was nothing heroic about what John Kerry did in Vietnam. He was on a fucking boat with a gun, shooting 13-year-old kids who were trying to defend their homeland from U.S. imperialism. All right? Not an honorable thing to do. That's not World War II. That's not storming the beaches of Normandy. That's imperialism. It's defending imperialism. It was awful. It was awful what John Kerry was doing. It was just horrendous. Just horrendous. And John Kerry's whole campaign was about what a hero he was for doing it. And they never talked about what he did when he got back from the war. That he was a protester. It was like, yeah, well, he did that. Yeah, he turned against the war too. Yeah, let's move on. Let's not talk about that. So right before the election, the way the Bush people were able to win is they put ads on the TV taking apart his record. And they had Vietnam veterans just get up and say, oh, this guy's not a hero. I got my arm shot off. All this guy did was shoot on a boat and kill a bunch of teenagers on his boat. Fuck him. Sunk him. Right? All they had to do is get up and say, this guy says he's a hero. Well, here he is. He's a big commie. He was protesting the war and disrespecting America. Where are his medals? And that's true. John Kerry had thrown his medals over a fence. Well, and when they asked him where his medals were, he didn't get up and say, well, I threw them away because the Vietnam War was not honorable. Oh, no. He wouldn't answer the question about where his medals were. So they had ads. Where are your medals, John Kerry? He had thrown his medals away at a protest. So he spent the whole campaign building up that he was this militarist. He was a war hero. He supported war. he was, and all the Bush people had to do is come along and say, actually, he wasn't a hero in Vietnam. Actually, he protested the war. Where are his medals if he's such a big hero? And the whole John Kerry narrative completely fell apart. It just completely collapsed. It just completely fell apart. And John Kerry looked like a lying, non-charismatic politician, which is what he is. That's what John Kerry is. He's a boring guy who's not interesting to listen to. The one good thing he did in his life was after he got back from Vietnam, he protested the Vietnam War. And what's hilarious is the people who worked with him, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which is the group he started, VVAW, became run by the Bobavakian people. The Revolutionary Communist Party became the leaders of that group, which is hilarious. He left. He started the group and he left a year later. And after that, from then forward, they were RCP. They were Bobavakian Maoists, which I think is hilarious, right? But the American people respect strength. And John Kerry spent his campaign trying to play up that he was just as much of a war hawk as Bush, downplaying his activism. And all it took was people pointing out, number one, the way he got his medals wasn't so good. It wasn't very heroic. Number two, that he did protest the war. So if he's this big patriotic, guy, why is there video of him, just, protesting the war, right? Three, where are his medals? And it all fell apart. Fell down like a house of cards. And he wasn't supposed to win. John Kerry wasn't supposed to win. It was just a psyop. It was there to get leftists to change the way they talked. It was about manipulating leftists. That's largely what the campaign was about. It was about getting people that were against what Bush was doing to become pro-imperialist. It was a psyop. I mean, the campaign, it was more about manipulating dissidents into being more like John Kerry than it was about actually defeating Bush. And that was very weird. The other thing, though, is that on some level, I think there's a very good chance the election may have been stolen, right? I was in my little town in Ohio. I grew up in this tiny town. Doesn't even have 10,000 people in it. And at my high school, they had voting machines, right? It was a voting place. You wouldn't believe how many fucking voting machines there were in my town. My little conservative town, there were tons of voting machines there. There was barely any line. There were voting machines everywhere. And everybody in my town, barely any place. I mean, it was a lot of voting machines in my little town in Ohio. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, where there's a huge concentration of the population, in African-American neighborhoods, they had 4 voting machines. In Oberlin, which is a very liberal college, Oberlin College, there were lines of college kids to vote, and the election results it was like 4 a.m, and they still hadn't voted yet. And it was a very close election in Ohio. In the state of Ohio, where I lived, that was the state that determined it. And ultimately, Bush won. And I think it's possible that the fact that there were not enough voting machines in African-American neighborhoods, in neighborhoods where working people have to go to work and, pay their bills, they can't stand in line to vote all day. There were 5, 6, 7 hour waits to vote. And in my little town full of Republicans, anybody could vote. There were 15, 16 different machines. You could vote. Everyone could vote. Made me believe that maybe Kenneth Blackwell, who was the Ohio Secretary of State, had done some funny business with the voting machines. I wasn't the only person to think this, by the way. A lot of people thought that. But why would they steal the election? Because if John Kerry had won, he would have done the exact same shit Bush was going to do. He would have escalated the war, etc. Because it was like some kind of weird psyop. If John Kerry had won, it would have sent a message that the American people were rejecting what Bush is doing. That's what it would have done. It would have been seen as a repudiation of what Bush was doing. And that was too dangerous. So I think there is a very good chance. There's a good chance that the election was stolen. I don't know for sure. I mean, I really don't know for sure. at the end of the day. I mean, the way the votes are counted, fine, but how many people didn't vote because they were in line in Cleveland? You know, how many people didn't vote because they were in line at Oberlin College and they never got a chance to cast their ballot? We don't know, right? And I mean, maybe it wasn't, right? Another clever thing that the Republicans did is in all the key states, they had a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage on the ballot. And all the evangelicals went out to vote because they wanted to vote against gay marriage. Because even among evangelicals, there was they weren't excited about Bush. There were a lot of, especially African American evangelicals, weren't excited about Bush because Bush was, he was leading the country to war. There were a lot of, beneath the surface, you wouldn't know it, but beneath the surface in the U.S. military and in the, in a lot of middle America, there's some kind of libertarian sentiments, even some right wingers. But by getting the anti-gay marriage amendment on the ballot, conservatives turned out to vote for that, and they voted for Bush. So it was the gay marriage amendment on the ballot that got all the evangelicals out to vote, all the conservatives. And on top of that, they got, they dissected. John Kerry's entire message was what a war hawk, warmongering, pro-military patriot he was. And they tore that apart, and John Kerry lost. And it was a very weird campaign. And I couldn't vote. I wasn't old enough to vote. But I was very active in that election. And it was a strange election. Let me just put it that way. It was a strange election. I look back on that and I'm like, what the hell was that? And that was very formative for me politically. It was a very strange election. And that was, that was the late Cold War normal. See, this is what all you kids, I'm only 34. Am I really an old man? All you kids, what you don't understand is it hasn't always been the synthetic left that's been the main current of U.S. imperialism. Throughout the late Cold War, starting, from the time of, Carter up until Bush, the Republicans were the main current being promoted by the U.S. government, and the Democrats were the opposition. Oh, thank you. I could probably. The Democrats were like the opposition, the controlled opposition, and the Republicans were the mainline current. Ronald Reagan was what you're supposed to believe. Walter Mondale was for people who were kind of questioning it, right? Bush was what you were supposed to believe. John Kerry was for people that were kind of questioning it. Now it's flipped. Obama is what you're supposed to believe. McCain and Romney are for people who are kind of questioning it, right? Hillary Clinton is what you're supposed to believe. Trump is for people that are kind of questioning it. That's a flip. That is a big flip, right? That it didn't always used to be that way. That's a very big flip in American politics. Very, very big flip. But yeah, I will say the first candidate I ever voted for in 2008, that was the first election I ever voted in. I voted for Cynthia McKinney of the Green Party. That's not a secret. I'm on video saying that. I voted for Cynthia McKinney. I'd never met Cynthia McKinney. I just knew that she was an anti-imperialist and she was running for president. In 2008, I voted for Cynthia McKinney. And in 2011, I actually got to meet Cynthia McKinney doing solidarity with Libya. That was a real honor. And I still admire Cynthia McKinney in a lot of ways. So there you go. Cynthia McKinney is a great woman. All right. Next question, right? If your goal is to gain greater political influence, how do you think you are going? And what do you advise your followers to do? First question, if my goal is to gain greater political influence, how do I think I'm doing? I mean, I'm doing okay, I would say. I mean, a lot of people know who I am. I have gotten the ball rolling on patriotic socialism. No one talked about patriotic socialism. I started talking about it. And when I first started talking about it back in 2016, everyone thought it was insane. No one had ever heard of it. And now there's Haas, and now there's Jackson Hinkle, and now patriotic socialism is this whole milieu on the internet. I did that, right? There's Peter Coffin and Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor, and, I got the ball rolling. No one was talking that way. And now Jackson Hinkle talks that way. Haas talks that way. Peter Coffin talks. There's this whole internet community centered around something I thought of. That's pretty good. Another thing, synthetic left is a term I invented, right? People have talked about the phony left and all that, the fake left. I was the first person to say synthetic left. That word has now been picked up everywhere. Ben Norton uses it. Max Blumenthal uses it. Synthetic left is a widespread term. I started talking about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I started talking about it, and now it's being widely talked about. There's articles about it. It's a fact you can't contend with. I started that. There's many examples of this. I feel like I've said many times, these streams are the equivalent of the Velvet Underground. You ever heard of the Velvet Underground? They're a rock band from the 60s. The lead guitarist was Lou Reed. The Velvet Underground did not sell anywhere near as many albums as the Beatles did. However, the Beatles all bought the Velvet Underground's albums, and everyone who bought the Velvet Underground's albums started a band. The Velvet Underground was very much, they were a rock musicians rock band. Right? They talk about Gertrude Stein. You ever heard of Gertrude Stein? Very famous writer from the 1930s, but nobody read her except writers. She was a writer's writer, right? The people who read Gertrude Stein went on to become novelists, but very few people actually read Gertrude Stein. But Gertrude Stein did stuff, experimental stuff, stream of consciousness, that other people had never done before, right? And Gertrude Stein did that, and so John Steinbeck, Ernest Hemingway, those kind of people read Gertrude Stein, and that enabled them to do what she had done. The Beatles listened to the Velvet Underground. They heard what the Velvet Underground said, and then they started doing it. I'm not going to say the name. I'm not going to say the name because I owe this person their anonymity. Many of you can probably guess who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to confirm it. I will neither confirm nor deny. There is a very popular Marxist intellectual. And if you listen to the way he talked 5 or 6 years ago, he talked very differently. Never defended the socialist countries. If you listen to what he talked about, if you ever brought up Cuba or Russia or the Soviet Union or China, he would always say, well, that's not socialism. Socialism is worker cooperatives. Socialism just means worker cooperatives. That's not socialism. Those are authoritarian. That's not socialism. I made friends with this guy. And this is a very educated man. And I became friends with him, and we talked about the Soviet Union. And we talked about China. And as a result of my conversations with this man, as a direct result of my conversations with this man, even though he still is in favor of worker cooperatives, I convinced him that it's important to stand up against the narrative that communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. I did that. This person would not defend China, would not defend Venezuela, would not defend Cuba, would not defend the Soviet Union. It wasn't for me. I did that. I did that. That was me. And it wasn't like I browbeat him and morally said, you must do this. No. It was simply me pointing out to him that the main objection people have to socialism and communism is it's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And he, as an academic, said, well, that's just not true. I mean, the Soviet Union had a lot of problems. Human rights were violated, etc. But economically, they did well. And I said, well, you need to tell people that because nobody knows that. He took it to heart. And you can notice there's a U-turn in the way he talks about this kind of stuff. And he doesn't agree with me on a lot of things. On a lot of things, this person. I'm not saying the name because I'm not confirming that it's the person you said in the chat. This person does not agree with me on a huge amount of what I say. So do not misinterpret what I'm saying here as saying this person agrees with me. He does not. I can guarantee you there are a number of things I say on here that he would go get red in the face he disagrees with. And this person has taught me a lot about Marxism, but this person has also, there's a lot of things he says that I disagree with, but I had an influence on him. If I hadn't been talking this way, and I had not shown him that it was safe to talk this way, and I had not pointed out to him the importance of talking the way I do about the Soviet Union and China and Cuba, and he would never have done it. I did that. You can credit me with doing that. So how am I doing? I am changing the conversation around socialism in the United States. And there's many other examples of this, right? Where I've told you about things. I mean, I wrote a book saying that BreadTube was probably a wing of the intelligence community, was probably being propped up, by a section of the ruling class. And then Max Blumenthal and Kit Klattenberg proved it. I never had any smoking gun proof. I just said, Steve Hassan, who's tied to Robert J. Lifton of U.S. military intelligence, who's involved in kidnappings and is clearly CIA linked, has got friends on the inside who give him inside information about the Moonies. And, Steve Hassan probably, who got on CNN and called for mass deprogramming after January 6th. I said, he's probably an intelligence guy. And I got inside information that he was advising BreadTube. So based on that, I said BreadTube is basically a deprogramming operation. I said that. It wasn't like I said, these are CIA people. I didn't say that. If you read BreadTube Serves Imperialism, they're like, he thinks they're all CIA agents. No, I don't. That's not what I say in the book. I say there's a section of the establishment that's promoting BreadTube. That's all I said. Right? And it's based on mainstream media promoting them, Steve Hassan advising them, etc. After I said that, Max Blumenthal and Kit Klattenberg did the investigative work, and they produced a document showing that a British intelligence institution, a British intelligence propped up think tank, is funding the work of Abigail Thorne. That Abigail Thorne, one of the key BreadTubers, is directly subsidized by the British government and by the British royal family and by this think tank that does their work on Syria and other places. So I did that. Me. So, I mean, how am I doing? I think I'm doing pretty damn well. I'm a guy who works as a TV news reporter for RT, who believes in Marxism, who writes books, who gives conferences. I think I've done a pretty damn good job. We staged a conference in Austin, Texas. And that conference made such a damn big splash that factorfiction.com had to do a fact check about whether it was real. The image of us with the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Z and the American flag and the Soviet flag on the stage of the CPI conference, that image was shared at least 100,000 times. And you think that wasn't a blow against the imperialists, right when they were whipping the whole country up into an anti-communist, anti-Russia hysteria. In the center of the empire, in Austin, Texas, 100 people gathered, and there was an image of people waving the flag of the Soviet Union, waving the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic, waving the Z to support Russia's denazification operation in the heart of the empire. You think that didn't scare the shit out of the CIA? You think that didn't scare the shit out of the Pentagon people? I did that. And you all did it with me. Okay, keep listening, Stefan. Keep listening. I appreciate it. I did that. So I think I'm having a bit of an impact. Now, how do I advise my followers to have an impact? The main way that I'm advising my followers to have an impact is to engage in education. The other stuff will come. Right? I'm not a union organizer. I mean, I've never been a member of a union, except when I worked at the insurance company They had a company union, a fake union that I had to join in order to get health insurance. But other than the fake union I was in when I worked at the insurance company, I've never been a member of a union. I've been to many pro-union protests, supported striking workers before, but I'm not a union organizer. I've never run for office. I did campaign for candidates here and there in the past, but I don't do that now that I'm working as a journalist. You know, I did a lot of protesting against police brutality when I was living in Cleveland. I've done a lot of anti-imperialist protesting. But the main role, I created CPI because what I can do, what I can offer that others cannot. Other people can march and protest. Other people can organize unions. Other people can run for office. I can't do any of those things. I mean, I can occasionally, well, I can't really do any of those things. What I can do is educate people and teach people Marxism. That's what I can do. And I'm doing it. And I can use the Center for Political Innovation as a vehicle to do it. So that's what I'm doing. And that's what I can do. And I think we're already having an impact. Nobody has pushed William Z. Foster harder than me, right? The CPI, we've started reading groups around the country to read, the history of the three internationals by William Z. Foster. I've got streams about William Z. Foster. I've got all kinds of stuff about William Z. Foster. Now we find out Chris Smalls and the Amazon Workers Union, what was the main thinker who influenced their strategy? William Z. Foster. Now, I didn't go up to Chris Smalls and say, Chris Smalls, read William. I didn't do that. But on my streams, you've heard me. If you've been listening to these streams, this is stream 371, right? So, but if you go way back, go to stream 1, go to stream 2, I'm talking William Z. Foster. I'm reading William Z. Foster out loud. I'm talking William Z. Foster. No one talks William Z. Foster more than me. I've been putting William Z. Foster out there. I've been encouraging people to read William Z. Foster. And now people are doing it. That's because of me. I'm having an impact. CPI is one institution, one think tank that's created to conduct socialist education, to get people to read William Z. Foster, to get people to read Gus Hall, to get people to engage and debate ideas. We published the Green Book by Gaddafi, and our edition of the Green Book is the top-selling and top-rated edition of the Green Book on Amazon. That's a fact. It's the best. It's the only one with page numbers, the only one with an introduction. Go and read the reviews. I put out a damn good edition of the Green Book by Gaddafi. That was me. Right? That was the Center for Political Innovation. We're getting shit done, and we're growing. And there's a lot of people who've stepped up to the plate and said, I like what you're doing, Caleb, and I want to help you out. Good. Great. I want your help, and I want to work with you, and I want to help you discover your own contribution. I want you to be able to give good speeches. I want you to be able to write good books. I want you to stream. Dust James was a fan of these streams, and then he started streaming. David Fox was a fan of these streams, then he started streaming. Good. There's other people. Tristan, a fan of these streams, he started streaming. They're a socialite. I want you to see what I'm doing and start doing it in your own way in order to advance the message of what we're about. That's what I want for you. So CPI, Center for Political Innovation, is about unleashing your skills and helping you to unleash your potential as a socialist. That's what I want to do. CPI is what I can do right now. I can't be in a party, can't start a party, can't run for office, can't organize unions, can't really be organizing protests. CPI is what I can do. And if you want to do it with me, great. And if you don't, fine. I don't care. I'm not going around telling people that this is what they should be doing. That is the difference between me and all these little parties. And that's why CPI is not a party. A party would have influence in the labor movement and be leading unions. A party would be leading protests in the streets. A party would be running candidates. CPI is doing none of those things. CPI is an educational think tank. We are educating people, which is something that a party would also be doing, which none of the parties are really doing, or if they are, they're doing a shitty job of it. But a party is like an orchestra. An orchestra has a trombone and a violin and a drum and a harp, many different instruments. CPI is one instrument in the orchestra. And as the struggle develops, other instruments will come along. CPI will remain and will probably become connected to something. And candidates will come along, and unions will come along, and protest organizers will come along, and other things will come along. CPI is one instrument in the orchestra that will eventually emerge, of which I will probably not be the conductor. Part of being mature is recognizing what you are actually capable of. When you're a baby thinks it's the most powerful thing in the world. All it has to do is go, wah, and it gets food, right? So babies think that they're like superhuman. But as a baby grows up, it starts to realize it's not superhuman. When you're 18, you think you can do anything, right? People joke about that. 18-year-olds, they think they can do anything. By the time you're 30, you realize, okay, there are some things I can do, some things I cannot do. Part of growing up is becoming aware, getting a realistic assessment of your own capabilities. And that's what I have done. I am not the next Lenin. I am not going to be forming the vanguard that storms the barricade. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a lot of good talks. I'm going to write some good books, stream, help other people find their strengths, build a Marxist think tank, educate people about socialism. That's what I can do. And maybe a time will come where I do more than that. But right now, with my current strength, with my current life situation, CPI is what I can do. And it's bizarre because that's it. I mean, CPI is an educational think tank. We're having classes, we're publishing books, we're educating people about Marxism. We're laying the intellectual foundations for people to do the work that needs to be done. And already it scares the living hell out of the synthetic left. These people have lost their fucking minds. You would thought I was organizing a militia or an army or something. Oh my God. The Communist Party has published this whole document about us. People are calling it a cult, calling it a party. It's none of those things. It's not a cult. It's not a party. It's just people having classes, people publishing books, people having conferences. You know, there might be a protest here and there around anti-imperialism. It's not that big of a deal. But oh my God, it scares the hell out of them. It scares the hell out of these people. They are just like, oh my God, Caleb is doing CPI. Oh my God, they're losing it. I mean, if they're flipping out this much, I mean, look at the Workers' World Party. I mean, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a noise? PSL, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a noise? You know, CPUSA, if a tree falls in the forest and only Joe Sims is there to hear it, does it make a noise? I mean, no one cares what these groups are doing for the most part. I mean, some of us that are nerds, that are into the gossip, we care what they're doing. Most people don't really care what these groups are doing. But I tweet one thing and they're talking about it for weeks. I mean, it's weird. It's weird. I am not a huge social media influencer, right? I don't have hundreds of thousands of people watching these streams. I don't have hundreds of thousands of people following my tweets, but when I do something, the ripples are everywhere. It's very strange. It's very, very strange. So I think what I'm doing is having a very big impact. I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep helping other people to do it. And I often find the impact of what we do a little bit disproportionate. And I find that to be fucking scary. There should be like 20 people doing what I'm doing, but only I'm doing it. And because only I'm doing it, it's having a very big impact. I hope that you, whoever you are watching this, will eventually be able to do something helpful to advance the struggle. And, you know, I mean, yeah, we'll see how things develop. All right, next question. That was a long answer. All right. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Do you agree with this quote? For the most part, no. That's a Spenglerian, traditionalist, conservative, authoritarian. I mean, a lot of times hard times create weak men. People that are very traumatized are not strong. That whole thing about that does not kill you makes you stronger, not necessarily. There's people that they can live through a traumatic experience, but it psychologically cripples them. Um, and in a lot of cases, there are people that hard times damage them for the rest of their life. And that's not always the case. In a lot of cases, people that have been through hard times get toughened up, like the slogan says. But there's a lot of people that look, they had a hard time, they grew up in poverty, and even though they eventually get to a situation where they have a decent job and all of that, they still, the fact that they were hungry as a kid, the fact that their parent wasn't there to give them the affection, the fact that they suffered from what families that are in poverty suffer from, it damages them their whole life. And they're weakened by it. So no, I don't buy that quote. That's one of those Spenglerian, authoritarian, rah, and it's, I don't buy it. I think it's an Oswald Spengler quote, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't buy it. I mean, there's an element of truth in it, but the opposite is also true. And in many cases, good times create strong men, right? In good times, people have access to more resources, they have more intellectual freedom. So for every quote in there, right? The quote is hard times create strong men. Not necessarily. Hard times can also create weak men, right? Strong men create good times. Not necessarily, right? There can be very strong men who do very evil things and tear apart civilization. Those barbarians who overturned the Roman Empire were very strong. But what they created after the fall of the Roman Empire was a significant depopulation decrease. So, I wouldn't say that. I love Sabi Sabs. Sabi Sabs is awesome. She's amazing. Big fan. Not necessarily. Good times create weak men. Again, not necessarily when people have access to things and are able to, a lot of times people can strengthen themselves because of good times. Weak men create hard times. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So all of that is a kind of, but I don't buy that quote. And that mindset leads to this kind of very conservative mindset. Look, there's a school of thought that we all know. I won't even get into it, right? Every kid gets a trophy now. When I was a kid, my parents beat the shit out of me, and that's why I'm strong and all these kids are weak. That's not reality. I'm sorry, but it's like, if you think our problems in society these days are due to the fact that kids like themselves too much, I don't know what you're smoking. Self-esteem among the generation that we have is very low. Kids these days, the pandemic, they don't have other kids. They don't have the social interactions that are necessary for development. They have Facebook and social media that's making them lose their minds. Kids nowadays, if you think that their problem is their parents didn't beat them enough and they like themselves too much, I mean, there's an element of lack of authoritarianism, perhaps. Maybe parents are too easy on their kids. Maybe we don't challenge kids enough. But on top of that, there's so many other problems that are the opposite of that, that are way the opposite of that, that it cancels them out by far. Right? This pandemic, the detrimental effect of social media, the demand on these kids, the testing. I mean, I'm sorry. If you think the problem in our society is that kids like themselves too much, kids have self-esteem too much, you're wrong. You are wrong. That may be a problem, but compared to many of the other problems facing the younger generation in our society, it's a drop in the bucket. And so that quote kind of feeds into that mindset, and that's why I'm going to disagree with it. All right. The CIA was the opium trade legalized by Big Pharma. Is opium an example of drugs as weapons? Well, look, Big Pharma, they're selling a product, and that product is addictive. And it's not just opioid medications that are addictive, psych meds. I mean, if you get on psych meds, try going off of those and see what happens, right? I mean, going off of them is a big problem. It doesn't kill you, but, it's not pleasant to go off of them. And a lot of what Big Pharma does is they are pushing pills. They're trying to make profits. Is it a conspiracy? It's a conspiracy to make profits. Yes, those boardrooms get together and they figure out how can we maximize our profits? What do we have to do to maximize our profits? And they don't think about necessarily the impact on people as much as they think about how can we maximize our profits. And we saw that with the opioid epidemic. Is it a conspiracy to control society? Again, it's a conspiracy to make profits. There's a lot of problems that we have in our society. It's not like there's some grand designer who just sits up there and says, yes, we'll do this, and yes, we'll do that. And the problem with that viewpoint is that if there was a grand designer who could do that, things would be a lot more stable than they are. The reason society is so unstable and unpredictable is because of the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market. That in those corporate boardrooms, they're just sitting there going, how do we make profits for ourselves? They don't give a fuck what the result is. And another corporation has a completely different agenda, and they're just trying to make profits, and they don't give a fuck what the results are. And that the problems of our society, in a lot of ways, are the problem of lack of planning, not a problem of conscious manipulation by elites. Now, there are conspiracies by elites. The elites do get together and say, if we do this, this will happen, and that happens. That absolutely does happen. I don't think the death of Kennedy I don't think Oswald acted alone. I think there's more going on there. But there's not like a grand design. There's not some thing high up on the thing that is able to manipulate all events. And if there was, they would do it in a way that maybe it was bad for everybody, would be a lot more predictable and a lot more stable. And often, one thing you have to remember is that in our minds, we tend to overemphasize the ability of people to predict the results of their actions. The butterfly effect. You've probably heard of this, right? The idea is that, you go back in time, you step on a butterfly, right? And then you go back into the future, the world will be completely different just because of one butterfly was stepped on. That's the idea, right? Well, why? Because everything is tied up with everything else. And often you will see things happen where, yes, there is a conscious decision to do something. Yes, the Council on Foreign Relations says we ought to do this. And yes, some corporation or lobbyist or politician says we ought to do this. And they calculate one of the results or some of the results. But then there's a whole bunch of results that they didn't think of. And so then they're scrambling to do something else. American politics, if you look at the U.S. politics since the Cold War, which I talk about in my book on Kamala Harris, it's very much an example of this, right? Factions in the ruling class battling for power with each other, and the strategy keeps changing. McCarthyism, great strategy for the ruling class. Started out with the Democrats. The Truman Democrats, didn't like the fact that there was an actual, anti-imperialist Rooseveltian wing of their party. So they whipped up red hunting, Red Scare, McCarthyite hysteria against the Roosevelt Democrats. What they didn't predict is that by creating that atmosphere, they would allow the Republicans to start accusing the Democrats of being communists. And after the Chinese Revolution of 1949, the Republicans picked up what the Democrats started. And the Democrats started saying, or the Republicans started saying, the Democrats lost China. They're traitors. And so the Republicans started using it against the Democrats. And so Republicans picked it up. And then within the Republican Party, the far right wing, the small business owners, started using it against the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers were Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans. And pretty soon, the Rockefeller Republicans were under attack by the far right of their own party. And Joe McCarthy was going after Republican Congress. And McCarthyism, again, the original intention, it was by the Truman wing of the Democratic Party. They said, we're going to start this McCarthyism to get the public to support the Cold War and to, purge the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party. Well, it did that, but then it led to hurting the Democratic Party, and then it led to hurting the Republican Party, and pretty soon you had Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats. The rise of Cold War liberalism was largely an attempt to contain what McCarthyism had started. Butterfly effect, right? The synthetic left. The synthetic left was started by the CIA because, they realized there were still a lot of people in the USA who were interested in communism and socialism, and it was more effective to fight communism by having this like fake communism, by having this like anti-communist leftism. So they started it. They promoted Herbert Marcuse. They sent Partisan Review magazine everywhere. They set up, the Institute for Policy Studies. They promoted the synthetic left. And pretty soon the anti-Vietnam War movement got going. And pretty soon, and the Black Liberation Movement. Great example here, right? There was a fear that communists would become the leaders of the Black community, right? That the Black liberation struggle had been led by communists. So the U.S. government started subsidizing, and promoting Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the South. And they started subsidizing Black nationalism in the North. This is a fact, right? That the Ford Foundation and others started giving grants to Black nationalists, Black Muslims, other groups, to do poverty programs and such in urban centers. And the idea was these people are anti-communist. They're not communists. So Black nationalism in the early 60s started spreading throughout the Black community. It wasn't a conspiracy. There's always been Black nationalism, but it gained a lot of momentum. Malcolm X became very popular, and you started to have, because the ruling class was afraid of communism in the Black community, they funded Black nationalism. What did this lead to? The Black Panthers, Black nationalist communists, right? Again, the ruling class was funding the synthetic left and Students for a Democratic Society and the Institute for Policy. What did this lead to? The anti-Vietnam War movement, the Weathermen, lost control of it. So then you had Nixon come in. I mean, there's many examples of this where it's like there are different factions in the ruling class who want different things. And there are factions that will say, all right, we're going to do this. But in a lot of ways, it's almost like playing whack-a-mole. That's what the ruling class are doing. You know the old game whack-a-mole? You ever play whack-a-mole? It's like it's like an arcade game where they have like a mole whacks up and you whack it. And then another one, whack. And it's like mole walks up here, wham. Mole walks up here, wham. And it's like, all right, okay, we got, the Black community is rallying around the Civil Rights Congress. The communists are the center of the Black freedom struggle. Wham, we whack it down. Oh, wow. Now the McCarthyism, is leading to, we wham. I mean, that's really what they're doing in a lot of ways. It's damage control in a lot of cases. The ruling class is trying to advance their own profits, and they're engaging in damage control. Long answers tonight, but it's worth it. It's worth it. Was Karl Marx a butthead? I don't know. Well, I mean, it's a weird question. I mean, there's all this stuff about Karl Marx. Did he cheat on his wife? Didn't he it's alleged that he impregnated his housemaid or something. I've heard people say that's completely bullshit. And I've had other people tell me that's completely true. And I don't know. I really don't know. Marx, I will say Engels is a much better writer than Marx. Marx writes in a very unclear way. Engels writes Marx's ideas very clearly. Marx thought of it, but Engels was a much better articulator. And there's a whole long, complicated explanation about why that is that I'm not going to get into tonight because we're basically done at this point. But anyway, it's been fun, folks, and I'll be back tomorrow night. Thanks. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.